Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Revolution Recap. Contract decisions have been made, and the Revolution offseason is officially underway. The Revolution declined the options of 7 players, and another 5 players are out of contract, leaving the current roster at 18. I'm Greg Johnstone. Joining me today is, as usual, is Sean Donahue. Sean, how is it going?
You know, I'm doing all right. We had a disappointing Spurs game this morning, but it was followed up by a disappointing game for Liverpool, so all things played out just fine.
And we're going to be running a little bit long on this podcast probably, so that counts as your Tottenham talk of the day. I'd love to drag that out a little bit longer, but your disappointment has been noted. We're also joined by Chris Fagundas of Revs Revolt. Chris, how are you tonight?
Doing fantastic. I'd be doing a little bit better if it was Revs lifting the cup, but it's pretty nice to see an OG club, raise that trophy.
In their last game at that stadium, too.
Yeah.
So
and I think it's good to... I was rooting for Columbus, too, because they had so many COVID tests and all that. I feel like if Seattle had won, that definitely would have been an asterisk championship, and I don't think it would have felt right. So I'm glad Columbus won pretty decisively in the end, even though they are our Eastern Conference foe and knocked us out a week ago. I think it was well earned. So enough about other soccer teams. We're talking about the one soccer team that matters, the New England Revolution, and they had a lot of news this week. They had their contracts decisions we talked about a little bit last week, and I think we got most of our predictions right. Players that were under contract that no decisions had to be made: Gustavo Bo, Teon Buchanan, Adam Buxa, Teal Bunbury, Alexander Butner, Brandon Bai, Andrew Farrell, Dejuan Jones, Henry Kessler, Matt Polster, Justin Rennicks, Damian Rivera, Matt Turner. So all players that I think people expected to be back, even if they had a contract option. And then extensions: Luis Caicedo, Scott Caldwell, Carles Heel, Brad Knighton, and then Colin Verfurth. Players that had their options declined: Isaac Anking, Jeff Caldwell, Nicholas Firmino, Michael Mancien, Kakuta Mane, Christian Pania, Seth Sinovic. And then out of contract, we have Tony De La Mea, Diego Fagundas, Tommy McNamara, Lee Wynn, and Kellen Rowe. So a lot kind of thrown out there. Obviously some key contributors gone. Outside of the starting 11 for the Revs, there's not a whole lot of depth currently on the team. Chris, let me get your key takeaway from this week's roster news.
Yeah, my takeaway has got to be the international spots that we have available to us. We're now looking at 3 available spots. We have 5 filled up. And that creates a lot of room for unique additions to this team. And if you're bringing in an international player, it's going to be someone that you're hoping is going to be making quite an impact, more than just a depth piece. If we can bring in 3 players that are going to be impact players, and a team that was already in the 2020 semifinals, that's really exciting to see. So my takeaway is just looking at those international spots and wondering what are we going to do with it, and I'm excited to see who comes in to fill those spots.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. You look at the players that the Revolution have as internationals right now: Gustavo Bo, Adam Buxa, Alexander Butner, Carles Heel, and Luis Caicedo, and all those guys you can kind of project to potentially be starters next season. So they moved on from 2 guys, and Michael Mancien and Christian Pania, who I think, if you're looking, projecting towards right next season, wouldn't be starters based on the Revolution roster. So, like Chris was saying, it makes a lot of sense to have those open roster spots, and you hope that the guys that you're bringing in as internationals are going to be regular contributors, which is, I think, why last offseason we were so surprised when the Revolution brought back Michael Mancien to fill an international roster spot. There were even some rumors last offseason that maybe he got a green card in some way to try to justify that decision to bring him back. But now they go into the offseason with the flexibility to bring in 3 international players that you would hope have a bigger impact than Michael Mancien does on this team.
Yeah, and with no designated players too, international spots might be the most valuable asset you have, as Chris said, to bring in kind of some bigger name free agents so you can bring on a higher salary. And the guys that are leaving the team: Wilfred Zahibo, who I know they traded last year, but his salary was, I think, in the 5s, $525,000. Michael Mancien, even though he came back on a reduced salary, was at $400,000. Christian Pania at $500,000 salary. So, just on those 3 guys alone, not only are you opening up those international spots, but you're opening up a big chunk of salary that you can go out and get some new international players that will fill in a little bit better. So I agree with all those points, and I think that's going to be very, very valuable. And if you believe Bruce Arena in his postseason kind of end of year press conference, he said that, even though the pandemic is making it virtually impossible to scout players in person, he's still getting to know players over Zoom and getting to meet players that way. And he said he had multiple Zoom conferences that day of the press conference. I guess that was Tuesday or Wednesday. So he's very clearly busy in talking to some international players that he's already got his eye on. So.
Well, there were always jokes about Mike Burns scouting players via VHS tape, which was, somewhat of a joke and somewhat actually true in some cases. And now in the COVID era, that might be coming back.
Yeah, well, hopefully we've got something a little bit better than a VHS at Gillette Stadium. But I don't know. I'm sure the Patriots will lend us a DVD player or something like that. Sean, what was your key takeaway from these roster decisions?
I think my takeaway was the same that a lot of people had when they saw this roster, which was the surprise at seeing both Nicholas Firmino and Isaac Anking being let go. Maybe they'll bring them back at a different contract, or maybe they'll go to Revs 2. But to me, my assumption is that they're not coming back, and my assumption is that this is a sign of the times with Bruce Arena. In the Mike Burns era, there was a clear intent that the Revolution were going to only sign homegrown players that they were very, very positive had a long-term future with the club. They weren't going to try to take risks. They were going to make sure they're going to hit a home run when they signed a homegrown player. They didn't want to be FC Dallas, a team that signed dozens of homegrown players and moved on from a lot of them within a couple of years. That was very much not the MO of the Revs under Mike Burns. I think Bruce Arena's come in, and he doesn't have loyalty to these guys. It wasn't Bruce Arena that signed them to homegrown contracts. It wasn't Bruce Arena's academy that brought these players up. So Bruce Arena saw these guys for a year and a half. To me, that's enough time for him to have made a decision that, at 19, 20, 21 years old, they're not going to necessarily make it as an MLS player. Again, maybe they end up coming back at Revs 2. I don't necessarily see that happening. It's a possibility. But I think that we're seeing a new era now where it's more about, signing these guys and, after 3 seasons, if they're not going to be making the first team, time to move on. They gave Zach Haravu 5 seasons, and I think it was probably obvious before 5 seasons that he wasn't going to be a regular contributor to this team. Bruce Arena's not going to do that. 3 seasons for these guys, 1.5 under him was enough for him to say that, it's time to move on. And I'm curious if we see the Revolution not necessarily become FC Dallas. I think FC Dallas, part of the reason they signed so many guys is that they have such a talented academy, but it wouldn't surprise me if we see the Revolution start to sign more homegrown players. And part of that too is because now there's Revs 2 for them to play on, but take more risks in that and be less scared of signing a guy that doesn't work out and having that, be a black mark on the team. I do think Mike Burns kind of looked at it that way, where if you had a homegrown player that didn't work out, it was kind of a black mark on Mike Burns. I don't think Bruce Arena necessarily feels that way. And I think the first signs we're seeing of that are Nick Firmino and Isaac Anking, with, again, the caveat being that, he doesn't have loyalty to them because they weren't his signings. I guess I was surprised by the move, but the more I think about it, the more it kind of makes sense that Bruce Arena's come in. He's got a different idea of how things should be run. And I think this is an indication of maybe what we're going to see as a trend going forward, that, we might see the Revs cycle through homegrown players more, where there's not going to be that fear of, if I sign this guy, I'm making a 5-year commitment to give him a chance. If I sign this guy and after 2 or 3 years, he's not working out, we can move on.
Yeah, and I'll also say that I took away the same thing. I was really shocked at them being cut. I assume their roster spots were safe, and we can break down the supplemental roster a little bit later. They don't occupy senior roster spots. I didn't expect them to be gone. I figured, as I say, I thought Firmino had a very, very solid season with Revs 2. Isaac Anking, I've always been a fan of, and he's shown flashes of potential, but injuries have really worn him down. They wore him down last season too. For those that don't know, I think he was in the United States U17 pool. He made his first team debut a few seasons ago at New York City FC, and just has really not had a great, been very unlucky with some health problems and whatnot, and it just seems to have spurred his development. So Isaac Anking is 20, Nicholas Firmino is 19. They're still youth team prospects, but I think overall Bruce Arena is looking at the players he has on the first team, and he sees that they're kind of blocked from where they are right now. Nicholas Firmino, I don't think, can break in through the attack, and Isaac Anking, if they're going to bring in another central midfielder, you have Scott Caldwell there blocking him. You have Luis Caicedo, you have Matt Polster, and then apparently you have a new signing if that's a position they decide to address. So Isaac King is also kind of blocked there overall. So I think it's just a bit of tough luck overall, and I think Bruce Arena says, we're probably not going to need these players, so why are we paying them $70,000?
And just to add there, I didn't see too much of the Revs 2 this year, but from talking to people that did see a lot of Revs 2 this year, there seemed to have been more surprised by the fact that Firmino wasn't brought back, and maybe less shocked by the fact that Isaac Anking wasn't brought back. And I do think unfortunately for Anking, he has had those health problems. Unfortunate that happened, but I do think that kind of stunted his development a bit. And at the same time, he's 20 now, but he turns 21 in January. And when you've been with a professional club for 3 years and you're going into your fourth season, you're going to be 21. At that point, in your career, you're still very young, but you start to expect that you're going to be having a chance to make it into the first team. And if Bruce Arena saw that at 21, he was still a ways away from making it into the first team, that one makes more sense to me. Firmino's another year younger, so you think maybe you'd give him more of a chance with the supplemental roster spot, but at least from talking to people that have paid more attention to Revs 2 and see more Revs 2 games than I have, it seems like there's more surprise about Firmino than there is about Anking.
Revolution Report asked us one of our listener question. He kind of said the same thing. He says, what happened with Firmino and Anking? Do you think they were offered Revs 2 contracts? Worth noting that I'd say Firmino was more impressive than Rivera this past season for Revs 2. He also noted on Twitter that Isaac Anking posted a photo of himself in Revolution gear. So maybe, that's a little bit of speculation if Anking is coming back. It might have just been Isaac Anking was working out and just was using his old gear or something like that. So TSB11 also said what's going on with Firmino and Anking. So I think the big surprise from a lot of people were Firmino and Anking leaving. So Chris, I'll let you get on a word here. Did you have any thoughts on Firmino and Anking leaving, and were you also surprised?
Yeah, I was definitely surprised. And when you were talking about Anking, I thought that he really impressed in the midfield when he was healthy. He really showed that he could command the midfield. So just seeing that they didn't want to move forward with him and hearing that it's unlikely that he's going to sign a Revs 2 contract was a little bit surprising. And similarly with, was it Firmino? I didn't watch a ton of Revs 2 either, but I did watch some. I've seen Firmino hit some really beautiful free kicks. He had 2 goals. I think one of them was disallowed. They were both fantastic shots where it wasn't because there was a USL 1 keeper in net. It was because there was no keeper stopping that. Just to see both of those talents and to see what could have been, and to think that they're not going to be carrying on with the Revs was definitely coming as a shock. But to your point, Greg, I think it's a lot of where are they going to fit into the senior team? How are they going to, if they come up, how many hurdles do they have to overcome? And are they going to do that? Is it worth hanging on to them at this point? And there might be a bit of, why don't we focus on developing some other young guys right now? There's no room for these players to move up, and Revs 2 is supposed to be more of a developmental side than it is supposed to be a winning side. So I think that might be some of the thought process, but I'm purely speculating on that.
And just a quick comment on one of those comments that you raised about comparing Firmino to Rivera. I think it is important to point out that Rivera is a full 2 years younger than Firmino. Rivera was 17 this season with Revs 2, and Firmino's 19. Rivera will be 18 next year. Firmino will be 20. That's a big difference. That's a very big difference. So if Firmino was impressing more than Rivera, that's great. But there's a 2 year gap there. So I think there's a lot more room for Rivera to grow.
Yeah, and if you're not going to bring up Firmino this year, when will you bring them up? And if there's no clear answer, I think that's what led them to part ways with Firmino.
And I think Justin Renix is also ahead of him as well. Justin Renix is currently straddling the Revs 2 and first team. And then, of course, you have a DP like Buxa, and if Buxa's not going to be around, they're going to bring in some other DP striker, you'd have to think.
Well, and just one last point is Rivera 2 had a really good preseason with the Revs first team. Again, I watched a couple Revs 2 games, not as many as I would have liked to, but Rivera did impress for the first team in preseason. I think that is something working for him too. And again, 2 years younger.
And if you're going to bring in Rivera long term, what do you need Firmino for? In terms of Revs 2 contracts, the reason why, even if they do get offered Revs 2 contracts, which according to reports is not happening, Matt Bluestein of Believe in Boston Sports reported that they will not be re-signing with Revs 2. And then Chris Creighton, also of Believe in Boston Sports, had a nice piece on Nicholas Firmino. He interviewed him this week, and Nicholas Firmino says he does not expect to get a Revs 2 contract offer. The reason why I don't think that matters too much is I don't see either of those players accepting a Revs 2 offer if they're not going to be getting paid like a senior team player. They essentially just got demoted, and it seems pretty clear that the Revs don't see them in their long-term plans. So I expect both these guys to go to a USL Championship side, which I assume pays a lot better than a USL League One team. I don't think either of these guys will be signing with an MLS team soon, but they're both pretty young. Nicholas Firmino was in the nominated for Young Player of the Year with USL League One, so he's going to have suitors for sure. So I expect both of these guys to be in demand and look for a pretty solid USL Championship side to land with. The one other thing, too, I'll say, which might be a potential explanation to why this has happened, it is a pandemic, and I know we want Kraft to spend, we want him to spend a little bit more money, but the reality is that a lot of teams are cutting back right now. They're doing a lot of layoffs. MLS cut 20% of their workforce at the league office, so there's going to be some budget cuts, and Enking and Firmino both made about $70,000 last year. So I think they saw them as expendable, and they might have been just a casualty of the pandemic and cutting costs, which kind of sucks when you look at it from a competitive standpoint. But as I say, not a whole lot of minutes for them going forward probably, and took up a roster spot and took up some money. So I think that's just an unfortunate reality of the business right now.
Yeah, no, completely agree. And I don't. I think we're going off their salaries from 2019. It's quite possible that they had contracts that had incremental increases. So I can't imagine they're making much more than 80,000 or something. But they were probably making a little bit more than 70 this year.
So overall, if you're looking at the roster, 18 out of 30 spots are taken. And also 12 out of 20 senior roster spots taken. So we can expect some MLS veterans and some international spots to kind of fill up that roster. There's certainly a lot of space for some solid veterans to come in and make an immediate impact. In terms of the supplemental roster, 6 out of 10 spots are taken. Basically what that means is, that's for draft picks, that is for homegrown players, et cetera, et cetera. So not a whole lot of room for youth players. Obviously, Firmino and Enking kind of open up 2 additional spots, but I don't expect to see a lot of players, signed this offseason in terms of the youth ranks. And then, as we said, 5 out of 8 international spots are taken. And I also, using 2019 data, and kind of some reported numbers, I took a stab at it on how much cap space we have. And my guesstimate is about 2.7 million in cap space. So don't treat that number as a solid 100% known number, but I have that about the Revs, so about 2.7 million in cap space, plus, and that includes 1.65 million in general allocation money. So if you guys want some numbers to kind of guess and have an idea of what they're playing with, that's kind of what we're going for. Speaking of depth pieces and players that we might see back on the senior roster, Bruce Arena apparently said this week on Zoe and Bertrand that he expects up to 5 players back. So we got some questions about that. Ronnie Small says, out of the out of contract players, who's most likely to come back on a reduced salary? And then we got a couple of other questions. John Pilkington said, who do you hope and who do you think will be re-signed and given an extension? And then Revolution Report says, do you think Lewin will come back? So all those kind of touch base. Sean, I'll go to you first. Up to 5 players come back. Who do you think of the players that are out of contract or had their options declined? Who do you think might re-sign with the Revs?
Yeah, I think it's mostly the guys that are out of contract. I think De La Mea, if he was willing to take a little bit of a reduction in his salary, would make sense to come back. Of the 2 center backs, I think there's some sense to bring one of the 2 of them back. Unless Mancienne gets a green card, to me, it makes a lot more sense to bring De La Mea back. I could see Kellen Rowe coming back. I think there were times this season where he looked good for Bruce Arena. What is he? Is he 30 now? I mean, he's still not that old. You could bring him back. We have no idea what Kellen Rowe was making this season. I'd be very interested to know that, but it wouldn't shock me if he came back. He was only on a contract for this year. Lee Win, it wouldn't shock me if he came back. Again, I think he's probably making more money than you would like to be paying him at this point in his career. So, he'd have to be willing to take a reduction. And obviously, contract negotiations with the Revs have been contentious with Lee Win in the past, but those were the Mike Burns era. So it wouldn't shock me if he was back. And maybe Tommy McNamara too. I don't know if it makes sense to bring all of those guys back. A lot of them are playing the same positions, but 2 or 3 of them would make sense. To extend it to 5 players seems a bit much to me. Maybe Diego, we know they offered him a contract. Maybe if Diego, strikes out in free agency, he ends up coming back at the $300K they originally apparently offered him. But I don't know. Looking at the guys that had their options declined, I don't know why you would decline Jeff Caldwell's option, because I can't imagine it was for that much if you intend to bring him back. And, I guess Christian Pania and Kahuta Mane are probably 2 guys too that are making way more money than they should be making for their contributions. So maybe those are guys that you try to bring back at a reduced salary, particularly Mane, because he's not an international. But if I were to guess, I'd say the 5 guys that are out of contract as opposed to the guys whose options are declined are the 5 guys that Bruce Arena is thinking about. I don't think there's any chance Seth Snowden comes back. I don't think there's any chance Jeff Caldwell comes back. And, based on what we're hearing, it sounds like Isaac Yanking and Nicholas Firmino aren't coming back. So that's where I land is the out of contract guys, or maybe there's still a chance they come back.
Chris, what do you think? Who do you think might be coming back, and who do you want to see come back?
Yeah, Sean, you pretty much hit on all my points as well. I have De La Mea and Wynn as the 2 most likely to come back. De La Mea mostly because, we need the center back depth, and he doesn't take up an international spot like you're saying. And it makes sense to bring back one of the ones that we already have. We do now have the news of John Bell, so maybe that throws a wrinkle in the plans here. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see De La Mea back. And then Wynn, I think that we saw what happens when Carles Gil is not available to play and how much this team falls apart, how much Gustavo Bo is not ready to fill those shoes. So being able to have somebody be able to step in and, take over the playmaking duties in case Carles Gil gets hurt, someone like Wynn is very valuable, but he would have to be on a much reduced salary, and you don't know how many more opportunities he's going to be getting in the league. So I think those 2, in particular, I think have a very good chance of coming back. Do I think Lee will come back for? Yeah, I do.
The one thing I'll say about Tony De La Mea, and Sean, you kind of brought his name up first. The one thing that I think makes Tony De La Mea interesting is that he's not eligible for free agency. So if a team were to inquire about him, they would have to acquire, or if a team in MLS wanted to sign him, the Revs would get some allocation money or an asset back in a trade. He doesn't have the 5 years of MLS experience to be granted free agency. So I think that might be tying De La Mea back to New England. So even though he had he didn't have his contract decline. He's out of contract. Yeah, I think De La Mea is an interesting name, and the Revs obviously need the center back depth. So, if you offer him $200,000, does he come back? He doesn't take up an international spot. I think that might work out for him. I think Kellen Rowe is also a guy that may be coming back. Chris, you seem pretty confident about Lee Wynn. I think he's a really good fit for the Revs, and I think the Revs might, if they can get him back, even if you have to overpay him a little bit what you think he's worth. I think that's worth it just because exactly what you said, that we've seen this team without Carles Gil. Having a second playmaker is a really, really big help. And I think Kekuta Manneh, he's at a pretty low point in terms of his worth. He does have free agency, but if he was a good clubhouse guy, they could use some depth on the wings. If he comes back on a 1-year deal, probably a similar contract to what Kellen Rowe signed last year, I could see him coming back. So yeah, I think those are all guys that have a decent chance of coming back. Tommy McNamara kind of might fit in that Kekuta Manneh spot too, or maybe he enjoys his time in New England and is willing to come back on a 1-year flyer or something like that. But those are kind of the guys that I point to and look for. And Sean, if you were listening to our own podcast last week, you'd know why Jeff Caldwell's contract was declined. It's because he would have had to have moved to the senior roster, and the Revs likely wouldn't carry 3. I don't think they want to carry 3 goalkeepers on the senior roster. So I think that's just kind of a tough luck for him. They just rather have Brad Knighton over Jeff Caldwell. So I'm going to call you out there.
Well, and we know that Bruce Arena is someone that likes his veteran players. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised that Knighton, what is he, 35 now, is someone that he's bringing back. And, maybe that's a foreshadowing for the offseason too, that, when you look at the MLS free agents that are available, don't be surprised if Bruce Arena signs some of the more aging guys out there. Actually, Knighton's going to be 36 going into next season, but don't be surprised if Bruce Arena signs some of the more aging guys out there. And remember, last year you were limited to 2 free agent signings, and Bruce Arena used that on Seth Sinovic and Kellen Rowe. I think if the CBA is ratified, I believe that limitation is gone. So again, don't be surprised if Bruce Arena ends up bringing in a number of MLS veterans that are over 30 next season, because that has been how he's operated in the past.
Chris Creighton also asked us something along these lines. Which one of these Revs that have been granted free agency do you think will find a decent home? We can extend this to the people who have had their options declined. And I assume that means who will find a decent home elsewhere. Chris, I'll start with you. Which one of these players that have had their options declined or are out of contract do you see finding a team elsewhere in a nice spot in a nice situation?
So if we're thinking that every single player that has been declined or out of contract theoretically is not going to come back to the Revs, I have to look straight ahead and say Kellen Rowe is probably a very an easy choice, I guess, to say is someone that's going to find a good home somewhere. And then the young guys, Enking and Firmino, I would not be surprised to see them end up somewhere playing behind. I don't have teams in my mind right now as to where they might go, but playing behind a starter maybe that's near the end of their contract and learning the way of a new team that way, preparing for minutes, in the next couple of years to really take on a starting role there. So the young guys I would definitely watch for. And then, Kellen Rowe is the other one I think that could easily land anywhere and fit in, as long as it's not RSL or SKC.
I mean, I think realistically, you have a lot of guys on this list that are at low points in in their value right now. We talked about when some of these trades were made that a guy like a Kudamane was kind of a throwaway in some of these trades, or So I think when you go through the Revolution list, I don't think there's going to be a lot of people looking to sign Sestanovic after the season he's had. I don't think there's going to be a lot of people looking to sign Kudamane after the past several seasons he's had. Unless he's willing to take a massive pay cut. Lee Win, age-wise, is at the tail end of his career. So it would make sense for maybe the Revolution to re-sign him, but I don't think he's going to be a hot commodity. Kellen Rowe's a guy that's, had a couple of down years. Maybe there'd be another MLS team willing to sign him again if he's willing to take a pay cut. Tommy McNamara is again towards the end of his career and coming off some not great season. To be honest, if I'm looking at this list and who's going to land on their feet, Diego Fagundas is probably the one with the most value. As rough as the year as he's had, he's still 25 years old. He's had some really good MLS seasons in the past. The past 2 years hurt him, but he's the one guy that you look at as he's proven he can play in MLS. He's 25 years old. He's due for a career revival, potentially somewhere else. So I think that there's going to be more offers for him, maybe not at the level of salary he's hoping for, but if he's willing to take something under 400,000, I think he's going to be a guy that lands on his feet. The rest of these guys, I don't necessarily know. De La Mea, if the Revs don't re-sign him, I'm sure he'll find somewhere to play. It may not be in MLS, it may be back in Europe. Who knows? But everyone else on that list, I think King and Firmino probably do end up in USL Championship. Jeff Caldwell, I think he probably ends up in USL Championship. Looking at this roster, the guy I feel most confident about, I would say, is Diego Fagundas, despite the fact that he's had 2 down years.
Well, let's get into Diego Fagundas because there's certainly a lot of news about him, and I'm kind of surprised it lasted this long before we got there. But, talking about the supplemental roster and Isaac Yanking and Nick Firmino, I think we find very thrilling. Diego Fagundas, a couple stories came out. First, Frank Delapa from the Boston Globe had a story. Sean Sweeney of Bay State Soccer Sentinel had a story. And then Jonathan Siegel of New England Soccer Journal also had a story. All interviews with Diego Fagundas talking about his time with the Revolution in the final months. Basically, the story that has happened is that the New England Revolution made an offer to Diego Fagundas in early October for multiple years, which I think was 2 years at $300,000 each year. And Diego Fagundas and his camp countered with a contract offer for $600,000. At which point the Revolution basically had a hard nope, sign it or leave it. They gave a final date of November 1st, which was the date of the last game at home, which, if you remember, Diego Fagundas did not make an appearance in. The Revolution had hyped up all week that he would be breaking the appearance record, and then Diego Fagundas does not appear in that game, and then he did not appear the next week in Philadelphia. So it seems like Diego feels that is related to the contract issue. And if you remember, Sean, we talked about this a few weeks ago. Diego's dad tweeted out on November 2nd that if to play or get a record, you have to sign what they tell you. What it is to put pressure. Haha, bye-bye. And I remember we were confused at that one. That apparently is tied to this contract scenario. So, Sean, now that it's all out in the open, what are your thoughts on the Diego Fagundas saga? How does this impact your view of Diego Fagundas? Do you have any sympathy for Diego Fagundas and how it was handled? And do you think the Revolution did the right thing?
I think the Revolution are doing the right thing by moving on. I think, again, Diego's had a couple of down years. There isn't a lot of room for him on this roster. He talked about in some of these articles that, he's best as, either a number 10 or kind of playing on the left wing. There were very few minutes for him in those roles on this current Revolution team. And, maybe if Pania and Kudamane are both gone, there's some more minutes for him. But, you still have Justin Rennicks that could be fighting for time there. Dejuan Jones and Tajon Buchanan when they're playing in midfield, Teal Bunbury. So I think it makes sense for the Revolution to move on. I think a $300,000 contract offer to Diego Fagundas is fair, based on what we've seen over the past 2 seasons. At the same time, I do think Diego Fagundas has been underpaid perpetually throughout his career. At the end of the day, you have to look to his agent, which is his father, and question that maybe he should have not signed those contracts, or maybe he should have negotiated better deals in the past. He's been under team control for a very, very long time. There were rumors that there have been offers for his services in the past, and the transfer price hasn't been there. But you have to question his agent if you're questioning the fact that his contract hasn't been good enough. And I think Diego wants to get paid for past performance and being underpaid in the past. But his past 2 years haven't justified that. So Bruce Arena wasn't the reason that Diego Fagundas was underpaid in the past. Either you can put the blame on Mike Burns, or you can put the blame on Diego's father. You can't put the blame on Bruce Arena. And I think Bruce Arena has to make the decision that's best for the Revs. And the decision that was best for the Revs was say, hey, Diego, we appreciate what you've done for the team. We're going to offer you a $300,000 contract. We think that's fair. Diego's dad came back with, we want twice that. And the Revs didn't really want to budge much from $300,000 because that's what Diego's probably worth based on the past 2 seasons. I feel sympathy for Diego. He's been on the team for 10 years. I don't think he's been paid as much as he's deserved. But the reality is the past 2 years haven't been great for him. He's talked about why that is. And I think it's fair to say that part of that is because they're kind of trying to play him as a number 8, and that's not really his position. Some of the way he was playing as a number 8 was because that's how he was asked to play. But there just aren't reality is there aren't that many minutes for him as a winger, and he did get some chances as a winger under Bruce Arena. He did get some chances filling in for Carles Hill. You can say it wasn't enough of a chance, but in those chances he did have, I don't think he looked particularly good. So, for the Revolution, I think this is the right move to do. And for Diego, I get where he's coming from, but I also think the reality of the situation is that, he's not worth much more than $300,000 a year based on what we've seen the past couple seasons. Chris,
let's get your take. What do you think about the Diego Fagundas situation?
Yeah, I was surprised to hear that the Revolution made an offer in the first place. I felt like, the way this year was going, there was not even going to be any offer. So the fact that they got one and then he asked for double was even more shocking. $300K seems more than fair, and it seems like the club reaching out saying, you've done a lot of great things for us. We would like to see you in a Revs shirt in the future, but I don't know. It could be a way of saying the Revs still want to sell more jerseys because Diego is probably one of, or if not the most marketable player that they have. And maybe they want him for that reason, and I'm not really sure. But $300K seems more than fair. And if my research is correct, so please, correct me if I'm wrong here. But a player that's going to be signed with TAM would be a $500,000 a year salary. Is when you start bringing TAM in to buy them down. So basically, he is asking to be paid like a TAM player at $600K. Yet he's been sitting on the bench for the better part of 2 years. I know he's played in a lot of games, had a lot of appearances, but he hasn't been starting a majority of those games, and the numbers are not there. I don't have his stats right in front of me right now, but I know it's been 3 goals, I think it was, in the last 2 years, and 1 assist, I think, this year, all year.
And the issue, too, with Diego, and I think we're kind of hitting it, is that Diego wants to be paid like a starting 10. That's what it is. And he feels he's a starting 10, which is, as you said, Chris, he wants to be a TAM player. That's how he feels he is. That's what he was for this team under Brad Friedl. He was also a star winger. He was team MVP in 2013. I think he was the Midnight Riders Man of the Year in 2017. He also had a very solid year as the 10 in 2018 before he was replaced by Carles Hill. I think it's fair for him to take that stance, but he needs to understand the Revolution don't view him as a starting 10. And the Revolution's contract offer is reflective of that. They view him as a 6 to 8, type player, central midfield player, backup substitution, come off the bench type guy. And that role doesn't get you $600,000. And so I think Diego Fagundas is fine to be confident in where he is. And even if he's not expecting to get paid $600,000, I think that offer is just so much further away from where the Revolution value him right now that, it's like the guy in your fantasy football league that when you send him a trade offer and he sends you back an offer that's so far like away from what you are hoping for and what you're expecting, you just don't even want to deal with them.
I'm that guy, by the way.
Well, no one likes you, Chris.
Yeah, I know.
You are the Diego's dad of fantasy football. That's what I'm learning here today, Chris. I do think Diego has a point, though, because it was brought up in one of the pieces that he's made $1.5 million over 10 years. And, I don't agree with Diego's classification that that's essentially playing for free. But when you watch, Claude Dielna come in on $900,000 and you watch Michael Mancienne come in on $1 million and then $400,000 when his contract is renegotiated, you see guys like Christian Pania and Michael Mancienne make more in 2 years than you do in 10 years. I'd be pretty pissed off about it too. And it's pretty clear that Diego Fagundas has gone to them and asked them for a new contract, probably through 3 coaches. He's probably asked for one in the Jay Heaps era. He's probably asked for one in the Brad Friedl era. I know he mentioned that Brad Friedl offered him a contract that was above what he was offered by Bruce Arena. And then Bruce Arena's offering him a contract now. So I think this is a Scottie Pippen-like scenario where, he signed a long-term deal when he was young. I don't think he understood his market value. And I think halfway through he realized he was getting pretty screwed by it, and the Revs had no interest in renegotiating a team-friendly deal.
Well, you look at his 2018 season, and he's brought that up a lot in these interviews because that was a highlight season for him. 9 goals and 10 assists is really impressive for any midfield player. And he was making $170,000 as his base salary that year. To get 9 goals and 10 assists out of a $170,000 player is phenomenal and, a fantastic team-friendly deal for the team at that point. But then you look at the past 2 seasons, 2 goals and 3 assists and 13 starts, 25 appearances, 2019, 1 goal, 0 assists this year and 19 games, 9 starts. Again, it's not a completely fair comparison because he was playing a lot as a number 8, which isn't his strongest position. But he did still get opportunities at his best positions, and he didn't look particularly well. I think we got a question about Brad Friedel's legacy that we'll get to later. But you look at 2018, and Diego Fagundas was one of the few players, I think, that under Brad Friedl actually improved because Diego Fagundas played really well as that number 10 in a team system where everybody was pressing and they were playing purely on the counterattack. He worked really well in that system. And now the Revolution are a team that can actually play in possession when Carles Gil is healthy, when Lee Win may be out there. They're a team that's capable of playing on the front foot and playing in possession. And we've seen less of an ability of Diego Fagundas to thrive in that kind of system. And I think going forward, you're not going to see the Brad Friedl system of pressing for 90 minutes and trying to create turnovers and counterattack. I think Bruce Arena has built a team where they don't have to rely on that. And I think when they're not relying on that, we haven't seen that Diego Fagundas can be the same type of player that can put up those numbers. And for that reason, I think for both parties, it probably makes sense to move on.
I think this is just the unfortunate reality of sports where when things end, rarely do they end well. And I think Diego Fagundas has certainly deserved a lot more than what he's gotten from the Revolution. But I think from a business perspective, I think the Revs are acting in their self-interest and doing the right thing. And I'll say another thing too, and some people have said that this contract offer that the Revolution have made is not respectful, more or less. Those are the wording that I've heard. I think I agree with Chris here. I'm pretty surprised the Revs made an offer at all, first off, because it seems like this is not going to be a pairing that's going to last much longer. But also 2 years, $300,000, I thought it kind of exceeded my expectations. He made $200,000 last year. I'm kind of surprised the Revs went up a little bit and gave him a 50% raise. I asked on Twitter, if you were the Revs, what would your contract offer to be to Diego Fagundas? One person said 2 years at $400,000. One person said 1 year, $500,000 to $700,000, which is kind of that TAM money that I think is a little bit high. But one person said 1 year, $250,000. 2 people said they would not make an offer. And then one person said, if I was the Revs, I'd offer $300,000 to $400,000, but another team might offer 1 year, $500,000. And I think that's where this is why there's such a big divide. I think someone might take a chance on Diego Fagundas as a starting player. He's 25 years old. I could see someone reaching out to him and giving him a 1 year, $500,000, $450,000 contract offer to be a starting 10, maybe with a 1 year team option, and try to see if he can bring back that 2018 form. But I don't think the Revs have any interest in playing him in that role. And, I have a lot of sympathy for Diego and how this all has been handled.
If Diego can go out and get his money, good for him, because he does deserve it. Yeah, best of luck to him from my perspective. I want nothing but to see him succeed, and go get your money, kid.
I bet there's a team out there with less depth than the Revolution that could use Diego Fagundas, and maybe, a $400K salary somewhere else makes sense. If I'm the Revolution, I could have justified a $400K salary to Diego Fagundas after 2018, maybe at a $450K salary to Diego Fagundas after 2018. But we're 2 years past that, and you have to look at what's been happening over the past 2 years and what the reality is. I do think that there's a team out there with less depth than the Revolution that Diego Fagundas could help. I just don't think the Revolution are a team where his role, if he were to resign for $300,000, I don't see his role increasing dramatically next year. I don't see, why that would change. So it just, for everyone involved, I think what's happening was the correct decision.
And even when Lee Win was out, Diego Fagundas didn't really get a lot of minutes at the 10. We didn't really see that kind of confidence in him playing the attacking midfielder role. So I think it's disappointing overall. And Sean, I know I texted you this. We got asked by James Downing if there's any comps for Diego Fagundas out on the open market. And the answer really is no, because free agency, it used to be you needed 8 years of MLS service. Now it's down to 5. So there's not many 25-year-olds that have hit free agency. I'm pretty sure Diego Fagundas is the first one. But I was trying to think of players that, might have been hyped up 4 or 5 years ago that, have had a couple of rough few seasons and maybe have been brought down a couple notches. And, I was kind of browsing, free agent contracts and all that. And the one name that came up that I think is the most comparable, even though it's not remotely close to comparable, is Breck Shea. He signed with Atlanta, I think after Vancouver let him go. He signed a 1-year, $225,000 contract. I think he was 27 or 28. And obviously he's a left back. He's not a attacking midfielder, so you got to adjust salary there. But that's a guy with international experience who was with the United States men's national team.
Played in the Premier League.
Yeah, I mean, if I would love for Diego Fagundas to get his money and get a $500,000 contract. I don't know if he gets a contract above $400,000. I'm happy for him. I'm a little concerned he might have overplayed his hand here, and I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful the situation works out for him because New England's not working out for him. But I think as we started this conversation with, I think he wants to be paid for past performance, and I'm not sure any teams other than the Revolution would do that. So I'm hopeful he lands in a really nice spot, and I'm hopeful he gets a very, very nice contract out of it because he definitely deserves it. Even though I'm rooting for him, I can't blame what the Revs did here.
Just another quick point on the comps comparison too is, we haven't seen somebody his age become an MLS free agent because of what the rules are. And also, more importantly, the new CBA takes away the limitations that we had in the past where you couldn't give an MLS free agent significantly more money than they made in the past. You were limited in what you could offer. I think that's gone now. So we really are in brand new territory. And it'll be interesting to see what Diego Fagundas does get, because I don't think there is anything comparable to his situation that we've seen in the past, just because the rules have changed too.
He is setting the market in a lot of ways. And for those of us who are interested in MLS contract nerd stuff, it's going to be very, very interesting to watch Diego Fagundas just as a case study.
Well, one point too, if you don't mind me adding on, going into the 2020 season, Diego Fagundas, and going into a contract year, he sees Michael Mancian take a pay cut, but his pay cut goes down to, I think, 470 base, maybe like a 600K salary for the year, something like that. And you want to talk about like not making an impact in the season compared to, what Diego has been able to do. Michael Mancian played 316 minutes in 2020, and none of those minutes were necessarily that great. I would say they may not have been as poor as previous years, but they definitely weren't great. And he's coming in and he's making that kind of money. Diego Fagundas coming in, probably comparable quality, different positions, of course, but almost 3 times as many minutes, 970 minutes for Diego Fagundas. And he's saying, well, if this guy can go over here and get 470 to 600K, where's my money? Where's my check? And so, that might be some of what, the Fagundas camp is going through when they're seeing similar scenarios on the same exact team.
And I think we got different numbers. I have 400,000 for Michael Mancian. Maybe it was 400 and 475 for Mancienne this season. But your point stands. That's more than double of what Diego Fagundas is making. And you know what? I can do you one better. Diego Fagundas probably pointed to the Revolution bringing Juan Agudelo back for the, 2018 or 2019 season when he was a free agent, and Juan Agudelo said, I'm going to go to Europe. And the Revs brought him back on $600,000, and he wasn't an impact player. I mean, he was almost Diego Fagundas quality at that point. So I bet he pointed to that, thinking that he'd get a Mike Burns type handout for the hometown special, but he didn't. So and one other note before I move on, I think this entire time Matt Turner is looking at his agent, who got him a 4-year, $200,000 contract, and is saying, "Hey, man." I'm got the same salary. I'm getting the same kind of screwed over, and I think Matt Turner is a lot more impactful than Diego Fagundas was in 2015 when he got his new contract. So a rough week for Matt Turner's agent. No one's really bringing that up. So I do want to move on. Carles Gil, one more note. He did have a option. So I assume the initial reports of Carles Gil signing a 2-year contract with 2 1-year options are that initial report is true. So I'm assuming Carles Gil also has one for next year. But it sounds like Carles Gil wants a new contract, and according to Charlie Davies, there has been some conversation about the contract. Chris, I'll start with you. Should a Carles Gil contract extension be a priority for the Revolution this offseason?
Yeah, I've said this in the past before too, where regarding Carles Gil, I think the Revs just need to, basically open the checkbook, sign a check, and give it to him. He's that type of player where you absolutely need him on the field. You need this guy to be a part of the team, and to build around this player as well. That said, the only caveat is make sure he's staying healthy. If we can get through half of 2020, 2021, whatever year we're going into, at least half of the season, and he's healthy and he's producing at Carles Gil levels, open that checkbook, hand it over to him, say, write down a number, and let's keep you on. How long do you want to stay?
Completely agree with that. He's going to be 28 this season. Hypothetically, he has 2 options, 28, 29. He's still going to have a lot left to give when he's 30, 31, 32. I think this is a guy that you have to try to lock up long-term now, so you don't end up in a situation where, he's in he's 6 months away from being able to walk away, and he's able to talk to other teams about what they could give them. The Revs have an opportunity to lock him up long-term while he's still under contract. I think they should try to do that. And, to Chris's point, it goes back to, keeping Carles Gil healthy, and to do so, I think that's where it would make a lot of sense to, sign Lee Nguyen 1 more year. So, maybe every 4th game you give Carles Gil a rest and let Lee Nguyen get a start if Lee Nguyen's willing to do that role and being kind of the rotational guy. So you're not burning out Carles Gil, because Carles Gil is so important to the Revolution. We saw this season when Carles Gil is out, they're a completely different team. So find a way to sign him long term before you get to the point where there's 6 months left and he's looking at his other options.
Yeah, the Rams get TAM every year. They get about $2.8 million in TAM this season, and you have 4 transfer windows to use that. And you can use TAM towards re-signing a designated player. So if they aren't going to be making any huge TAM signings, they might be, bringing in some international players, but no one necessarily on with DP money or transfer fees to that extent. So we might see, might be a good window to use some TAM on re-signing Carles Gil and tacking on a few more years to that contract, because you certainly don't want him going into next season with 1 year left on his contract and looking to Europe if he's put up another best MLS 11 season. So
and you might have to replace Gustavo Bo after next season, I think, and if you do, you don't want to have to replace Carles Gil too.
Absolutely, good point. Let's get to some listener questions here. Raleigh Revs fan says, what do you see Tejon's position long term? Can he become our right back of present and future if they is that what you think his role is? So, Sean, I'll go to you first. What do you think of Tejon at right back?
I go back and forth on this. I was convinced after a couple games in the playoffs that that was a good long-term idea. I'm less convinced now, but still, if I look at the Revs options at right back right now between Brandon Bye, DeJuan Jones, and Tejon Buchanan, I think Tejon Buchanan absolutely has the highest ceiling at right back. And if you have a midfield where Carles Gil is going to maybe be playing to the right of Gustavo Bo, and Gustavo Bo is kind of playing more of a withdrawn forward, not a number 10, but kind of playing in that central position, then it makes a lot of sense to put Tejon Buchanan there. So I said it before, if the Revolution are going to be playing the same system next season, I do think long term it makes sense to continue to pay Tejon Buchanan there, and I do think he's the Revs' best option at right back. With that said, I don't think it would be a bad idea for the Revolution to find a veteran right back that's more experienced in the position to at least give them another option there going forward.
Josh Nye asks us, do you see the Revolution transferring Matt Turner overseas this offseason? And if so, do you think they'll look to bring in someone to fill the role or look from within? So I might kind of take the lead on this one because I think I can put a stamp on this one pretty quickly. But as I just hinted a second ago, Matt Turner signed an extension in 2019. He's got 3 more years of team control, according to Julian Cardillo. Right now, pandemic, I don't think a lot of clubs have a lot of money lying around. And I think, you're going to have to pay above market value to get the Revolution to give up Matt Turner, who's on a pretty team-friendly contract. He's not using any TAM. He's on a pretty good contract for them for one of the best goalkeepers in the league who might be going to the United States men's national team, which is also very marketable from a team that wants to grow on the Boston sports media landscape. So I think it's going to be very, very tough for a team to pry Matt Turner away from the Revolution, whether or not Matt Turner likes it or not. So I think Matt Turner is more likely getting another contract extension than getting sold this offseason. So Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, similar to what you said, I think it's going to be difficult for any team to come in and take him away, but I think any team out there that's going to be in need of a goalkeeper has been looking at Matt Turner. What he's been doing for the Revolution has just really been remarkable, especially coming from such a non-soccer background. You don't see that sort of rise happen ever. He had a 75 or 76% save percentage this season, which is really good. It's his second highest save percentage in his MLS career, behind only last year, and that's only by like 1/10 or 1/100th of a point, I should say. So it's, he's showing that there's consistency there. Any team that needs a keeper should be coming in looking for him. The price is going to be high, and that's the only thing that's going to stop any team from coming in and buying him. I don't know what his value would be. I would say, complete speculation guess here, somewhere in the $6-7 million range is probably what the Revs would want for him, because he is going to be such a marquee player for this team going forward, and they're going to want big bucks if any team is going to come in and pry him out.
I think Julian Cardillo has a market and value of $4 million or something like that. The number would have to at least start at $4 million. So I think that $6 to $7 million was Zach Steffen money, and I think you're right that if I'm Bruce Arena, that's the money I'm looking for to sell Matt Turner. But Sean, real quick, what do you think about Matt Turner?
Yeah, I just think that you brought up a great point, and that's that Matt Turner probably has a future with the U.S. national team, and that future might be this year. I don't think he's going to unseat Zach Steffen, but he has every opportunity to get a lot of appearances this season. I wouldn't rule out him being transferred in the offseason, but I think it's unlikely. I think the value that the Revs have for him is going to be higher than the value that other teams have for him. And I think his value is going to go way up if he gets an opportunity to play multiple games for the U.S. national team and does well. And I think Bruce Arena knows that. So I think, we might not see him be transferred this offseason, but we might see him, get a chance in the Gold Cup next year to have a run, and he might do really well, and that might drive his value up to that $6 or $7 million that the Revolution value him at, and they might get that next offseason. So I don't think Matt Turner is going to be on the Revolution forever. I think he is going to end up in Europe someday, but I think next offseason is probably more likely than this offseason, or maybe even this summer. You never know. European teams offseason is in the summer, and they might look to bring in a goalkeeper at the preseason to help them out. And, maybe Matt Turner gets a run in the Gold Cup, and that leads to a team wanting to make an offer for him that meets the Revolution's valuation.
I think the Gold Cup point is very interesting too, because I think a lot of European teams, if he gets a few appearances here and there, I don't think he'll supplant Steffen, but just being called up to the Gold Cup, I think is a pretty good sign and boosts a little bit of value for the Revs. So Revolution Central asks, what qualities should the Revs be going after in a central defensive midfielder, assuming that is one of the positions Bruce is prioritizing? I assume that is one of the positions Bruce is prioritizing. Sean, what should the Revs be looking for in a central defensive midfielder?
I think they need someone that can have the influence on a game that the Revolution have only seen from 2 players, and that's Shari Joseph and Jermaine Jones. Now, those players are very difficult to get, but I think they need a central midfielder that can, both plug gaps and win balls in dangerous situations and know where to be to make interceptions, but also a guy that can play a huge part in the team's possession game and not just play side-to-side passes, but play those defense-splitting passes. There's some guys in the Revolution roster that have occasionally been able to do that. Even Wilfred Zahibo, we saw at times, was occasionally able to do that. They need someone that can do that with consistency, and they need someone that's not going to turn the ball over under pressure. The Revolution have had two really, really dominant players in this position that have been the standard bearers for the team and have set the bar really high in Jermaine Jones and Sharby Joseph. And, maybe you can't get somebody that has quite that amount of influence, but you need something closer to that, because I don't think anyone on the current roster, is even a poor man's version of that. So that's what I think the Revolution need, a guy that's going to, perhaps lead the team in touches from that position and do so in a way where he plays a huge role in transitioning defense to offense and plugging the gaps and winning those interceptions. I've long said that that's the position that the Revolution could change the Revolution team the most, is from an influence standpoint. And I think that's what they need to focus on in the offseason.
Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, so I have in my notes here, it's a pretty simple answer. It's a large Scott Caldwell. A player like Scott Caldwell that plays the possession style, that makes smart decision, that he knows where to be on the pitch at all the time, at the right spot at all the right times. But the one thing that Scott Caldwell is lacking, is going to be impossible for him to acquire via skill or anything like that. It's it's all genetics, it's size, and the whole Revolution midfield in general is lacking that. It's hard to win a lot of aerial duels in the middle of the pitch, and without that, that size presence, we're gonna lose a lot of challenges just in that middle third in general. So if you can get a player like Scott Caldwell, maybe a Scott Caldwell, Wilfred Zahibo hybrid, that's the player that they should be targeting. I don't know who that player is, but we need to go find him.
And we got another question here too from John Pilkington, who asked a question earlier, but what position do we need the most improvement? So Chris, I'll spin it right back to you here in a second, but if you're the Revs, if you're Bruce Arena, what areas are you looking to improve?
Yeah, so this might be more of a bold take, because the position that I want to improve upon here was the 2020 Golden Boot scorer, the Teal Bunbury left mid spot. Yes, he bagged 8 goals for us this year, which is absolutely fantastic, but that's not necessarily what you want that position to be producing at. He doesn't necessarily fit the mold of what you need. We need a lot more chances created there. He only had 1 assist to go along with his 8 goals all year, and we have DPs that we have signed to score goals. We need somebody that's going to be able to provide the ball to those designated players in goal-scoring spots. And I love Teal Bunbury. I'm not going to say anything negative about him. I definitely want him to be involved in the team, and I think that he needs to be involved. But I think that position that he's playing, it needs more of a playmaking player there. So that's my biggest upgrade. I know there's a lot of spots that maybe need upgrades, but defensive midfield, we have Caicedo coming back. Again, I was saying we could use some height there, but there's pretty good depth throughout the entire 11. My biggest problem is getting the ball into the box, and we've tried it with Kakuta Mane, tried it with Christian Pania, tried it with Teal Bunbury, and it's not working for any of them down that left side.
Diego Fagundas is a free agent. Maybe we can add him to the.
I think it's too expensive for us.
I think I agree with Chris. That's number 2 on my list. I think number 1 on my list is still either a number 6 or a number 8. I think, again, you have a lot of depth in that position. There's a lot of guys there, but I don't think any of them are the guy. I think all of them are good complementary pieces as a number 2. But I think, that's the position that they need the biggest upgrade in. And then I think, I agree with Chris. And then I think the fullback spots, I think the hope is that the players you have there now continue to develop into becoming better players at those roles, because I do think they need improvement there. But I think the hope is that it comes from development rather than new players. And then I think just depth at center back, especially if Manciad and Delamay are gone.
Do you think Dejuan Jones is the future at left back, or do you think Alexander Butner are going to take that back and we're going to move on from Dejuan?
I still think Dejuan is the long-term future at left back, but I do expect if Butner is healthy that we're going to see a lot of him there next year.
Seth McComber did make a point today that Dejuan Jones is right-footed, and Bruce typically wants a left-footed left back. So I wonder, if Dejuan Jones is more of a right back, but I don't know, that right side is pretty crowded. I think Dejuan Jones, I still think he would be very valuable as a winger to push up, but I don't know, he seems to fit left back pretty well overall, so I'm not too upset if that's where he is stuck.
There's never seemed to have been any interest in trying him as a winger since he's been on the Revolution. There's been opportunities where it seems like it would have made sense to give him a run out, or he's been on the bench. There's been a chance, and there's never seemed to be any appetite to even try him as a winger, which I find fascinating, but I also take to mean that we're never going to see him there.
I'm going to die on the hill that he is meant for the Kakuta Mene, come in 65th minute and burn past tired legs type winger role, but
it would make sense. We just never see it.
Never going to see it. And I've been saying that for 2 coaches now, so I guess I'm wrong. But TSB11 says, any rumors on Bruce's priority targets? I'm especially interested in central midfielders. And Quite Rev says, any ideal transfer targets with actual names for the first team would be great. I don't know any rumors. If we knew rumors, we'd be getting paid for this. Bruce keeps all of his signings very, very secretive, and even the guys that are on the beat, so to speak, are not in the know about those types of things, to the point where when someone does get a scoop before the team announces it, it's pretty impressive overall. So I don't have any rumors outside of Bojan that we heard a couple of weeks ago. I did check up on Petrus Bumal, who did sign with a team in Turkey, so I think we can cross him off the list. He was a transfer target from this past summer. In terms of ideal names that I was looking at, I was looking through the MLS free agents, and one name that I thought was pretty interesting was Will Trapp, is a free agent with Miami. He's been tied to Minnesota to replace Alonso up there, Ozzy Alonso, but I think Will Trapp would be a pretty interesting signing for the Revs. He's still only, I think, 27 or 28, former, U.S. men's national team pool player. So I think Bruce Arena has a bit of a rapport with him. I think that might be the type of signing that the Revs are looking to go out, not necessarily a DP or a TAM signing, but you could probably bring him in on, $500,000 or so, just to stabilize that midfield.
Yeah, I mean, he had a down year last year for sure, and we know Bruce Arena is a guy that likes to have reclamation projects for some guys. And I thought he was older than 27. I think he turns 28 next year. But going back to Chris's point that I agree with, he's another 5'8" central midfielder. So you still have that lack of height problem that the Revolution have had in central midfield. And going back to the original question, I don't know any rumors either on what position the Revolution are trying to sign, but I think you can read between the lines and see what Bruce Arena did last year with his trades. And he kept trying to make moves in that central midfield spot, whether it was, bringing in Kellen Rowe, making a trade to bring in Tommy McNamara, bringing in Lee Win, Lee Win more of a 10 than it is 6 or 8, but still kind of a, central midfield player, moving on from Wilfred Zahibo. And then he brought in Matt Polster, and then Matt Polster was on the bench a lot. He kind of lost his starting spot. So I don't think it's unfair to draw the conclusion that Bruce Arena is not happy with that position either. And I think it is, if you're going to project and read between the lines, I think it's a safe bet to say that Bruce Arena is thinking about that position.
Yeah, you know what? I've been trying to think about a player that would fit into this role, and I'm having a really hard time pinning down a specific name. My approach to it would probably be a little bit different than Bruce Arena's, I guess, because Bruce Arena does like his MLS veterans. But I'm, again, my key takeaway was looking at those international spots that we have available. I know we have money to spend. And then I'm looking down at Miami. Okay, I know they got a ton of extra allocation money because they were a new team for 2020, but they got Matuidi on a TAM deal, I think it is. And so is there a name similar to a Matuidi that we might be able to find out there, maybe an older player that would fit the role of what we need? The player that comes to mind is Marwan Fellaini, but I think he's playing in China or something like that now, and he's probably, if he's in China, he's making buku bucks. But a player like that, you want an experienced, tall CDM, and I would love to see, a former Prem player come over with, bring that experience over, and just really command the midfield. That would be like my dream, as like a Fellaini type CDM, but I don't have a specific name for who they might target.
It just, one kind of thing looking at Bruce Arena again is, Yeah, it sounds crazy, but I wouldn't be surprised, and it's not an exciting signing, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a guy like Jeff Larentowicz, who's going to be 38 soon, come back to the Revolution. That's the type of signing that Bruce Arena hasn't been against in his career. He played a 38-year-old Greg Berhalter at the LA Galaxy. He's never been a guy that shied away from veterans, and I don't think that would necessarily be a terrible move to have a veteran if you bring him back at a lower salary. This isn't the game-changing central midfielder move, to be clear. This is the veteran depth. It wouldn't shock me if we see a guy like a Jeff Larentowicz, or even if we see them make a move for an Ozzy Alonso at 35. It's a relatively young Revolution side overall. There aren't many guys on the wrong side of 30, and Bruce Arena has been a guy that has very much shown a willingness to sign guys on the wrong side of 30 and plug them in. So don't be shocked if now that the floodgates are open and there's no 2-player limit on MLS free agents you can sign, that we see more guys like that. Or Matt Besler has been a name that's been bandied about. I don't think Matt Besler would be a great signing. The reason he's leaving Kansas City is because his play has kind of fallen off the map over the past 2 years. But that wouldn't be a move that would surprise me if Bruce Arena moved on from Mancienne and De La Mea and went to Matt Besler. Now I don't love that move, but that's the type of thing that again, not the game changing move. I think Bruce Arena is going to have to go out there and sign a more expensive player to upgrade the team, but I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing bench depth roles, more of those filled this year with MLS veterans that are on the wrong side of 30.
And another guy, too, is Kendall Wasston, not Watson, as I call him all the time, but Kendall Wasston of FC Cincinnati was let go, basically because of a high salary. His 2019 number was $625,000. But if we're talking about Matt Besler, who's 33 and was making $575,000 in 2019, I think we should add Wasston, who is 32, in that category as well, as kind of a third center back to kind of get a spot start here and there and kind of fill the Tony De La Mea role. So yeah, I agree with all of that too. I wish we had more leads, but as I say, Fortress Foxborough applies to transfer rumors as well. With that said, I do expect them to move fast. It seems like Bruce Arena has his targets. He's trying to bring them in. I mean, it's currently December 13th. I think we're going to be talking about a signing before the end of the year. So I do expect Bruce Arena and the Revs to kind of move fast, and we'll probably be talking about it in a few weeks. So Mike D asks us, what should the expectations be for next season? Would a run short of the Eastern Conference be a failure or a step back? And James Downing, kind of on the other side, has a similar question. He says, I wonder if the Revs are further away from being a contender than we think, since so many teams were without key players, and TFC was going through so much during the playoffs. So talking about expectations next year, Chris, I'll start with you. What do you think the Revs' expectations should be? And if they don't get to the same spot, do you think that's a failure?
So yes and no. I think putting weight into the way that the playoff structure is now, a single elimination, is going to be really hard to say, oh, it's a failure because we lost in the first game. You might have just had a bad game. It happens, and now we don't have the two legs, the home and away, to really find out, to get the better of the two. It's just such a crazy scenario. I do think the expectation of reaching an MLS Cup should be there. We should have that type of team. But even if we get knocked out in the first round of the playoffs, I think our expectations need to be where we sit in the Eastern Conference. If we're not a top 4 team, I don't think that this team is making progress. We were top 2 in the league this year when it comes to the playoff standings, where we finished, and that was with everybody healthy. And obviously we were a post and a couple other shots away from making an MLS Cup. So we really should have very high expectations next year. And I think if you can't hit 4th or better in the Eastern Conference, that's going to be a disappointment. And I think that's where the main expectation lies.
Yeah, I know. I think the goal has been set this year. They made it to the Eastern Conference final. Bruce Arena's first full season, and now he's got another offseason to make this team better. So I think the expectation is that they do at least as good as they did last year. With that said, great point that Toronto FC they're a team that spends a lot of money. I think they're going to be a good team next year. They fell apart in the playoffs, but I think they're going to be a good team next year. Atlanta had a terrible year, but they're a team that wants success and they have owners that are going to make sure they get success. I don't think they're going to be as bad as they were this year. I think they're going to be a team that's going to be a lot better next year. The Columbus Crew, they thoroughly outclassed the Revolution in the Eastern Conference Final, and then they went on to win MLS Cup by the biggest margin of victory that there's ever been in an MLS Cup. So, I don't see any reason why they're going to, not be just as good next year too. So there are a lot of really good teams in the Eastern Conference. I think, New York City FC, another team with really high expectations that I think will be better next year. So I think the Revolution, to consider next year a success, need to go at least as far as they went this year. And maybe that's an unfair expectation because I do think the East is going to get better. But, if Carles Gil is healthy all year, they were a team that was missing some of their key guys this season due to health. So if they're healthy next year, I think that needs to be at least the goal. And if they don't reach it, maybe calling it a failure is harsh, but there's certainly reason to be disappointed because they set those expectations this season in which they had a lot of things going against him, in which Bruce Arena had his first full off season, and now year 2 is where you want to see them get even better. So it's fair to expect at least the same as last year.
See, I'm more of the James Downing than Mike B stance on this, because I think the Revs could get better in 2021, but still, get knocked out or potentially miss the playoffs. I feel like there's a lot of sleeping giants in the Eastern Conference. You kind of talked about this, Sean. Atlanta, Miami, TFC, all those teams are probably going to be a stronger team going into next season. Philadelphia, I expect to kind of fall off the map with Eriksson and McKenzie leaving, but you wonder how they're going to reinvest that money. Nashville had a pretty strong run kind of towards the end of the season this year, and I assume they're only going to get better in year 2. Columbus is the defending MLS Cup champions. And then you mentioned New York City FC. I mean, do the Red Bulls kind of restock for next season? So, I think there's a lot of teams that are in a position to strengthen their squads and do a little bit better. I know there's a few teams that are falling off. Philadelphia, I think Orlando might fall off a little bit too. They have some ownership questions there. So I'm not sure how much improving they're going to be doing this season, but it's very possible that the Revs end up in a 5-6 seed next year because some teams just kind of pass them or they get healthy and the Revs get knocked out one round sooner, even though they bring in some more players and strengthen their squad. So it's hard for me to say that ending up in the Eastern Conference Finals would be a failure, but it certainly would be disappointing, especially seeing the potential that the team has now. So. Real Me MP asks us, what's Brad Friedl's legacy today? So I think Brad Friedl in the end got a few things right with Matt Turner. We've certainly taken some shots at him in the past. Sean, I'll go to you. What is Brad Friedl's legacy today, and has anything changed for you recently?
I mean, he was a terrible coach. He's still a terrible coach, but he gets credit for giving Matt Turner his first chance to actually play. He wasn't the one that brought Matt Turner in, Jay Heaps was, but he was the one that gave him a chance to play. And then he certainly gets credit for whatever his involvement was in bringing in Carles Gil. Other than that, I don't have too much to give him credit for. And I think, building on the Matt Turner thing, Matt Turner, gave him some credit for, after one of the playoff games, quoted Brad Friedl. So he was influential on Matt Turner, we talked about in past episodes. So I give him credit for some of Matt Turner, and I give him credit for his involvement in Carles Gil. Other than that, I don't have much to give him credit for.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in the same boat as that. As far as the Brad Friedl's legacy, I guess I'd like to see him maybe get a GM role somewhere, because I think that he does deserve the recognition for the Matt Turner and for the Carles Gil moves that he's made. Again, coaching, I don't think he needs to be near a sideline again. His performance speaks for itself from that standpoint. But as far as being the GM role, maybe building a roster, there might be something to it. He brought in Christian Pania too, I think, and that was really good from the start, at least. So I give him credit for a good move there. And if for every Carles Gil and Matt Turner we're gonna get a Guillermo Hauche and Cristian Machado, I'll take that. I'll take one bad signing for a great signing, or one terrible move for a great move every day.
And you can't forget MLS All-Star Wilfred Zahibo. I believe was also a Brad Friedl era signing.
Yeah, it's Zahibo for Claude Dielna. You can swap those out too, right?
It is kind of tough to judge because we're talking about players that have been brought in the Brad Friedl era, and you do have to wonder if he was given more control, if Mike Burns wasn't there, would that have been a little bit better? Because he talks all the time about how he would have done a little bit more roster turnover. And, I think on the player acquisition side, I think you're right, Chris, that, maybe we'd have a little bit of a better conversation that he brought in Carles Heel and whatnot. But the problem was he wasn't the coach here. He wasn't the GM here. He was the coach. And he was bad. And it wasn't, the results were pretty terrible. He started out good. But I think if you go back, they benefited from a lot of red cards, when he started here. I mean, his record was piss poor. And, I'm sure Matt Turner learned a lot from him. He's probably an excellent goalkeeper coach. I think if he ended up being like the goalkeeper coach for the US U20 or something like that, he'd probably be really good at that. But he kind of came in with this kind of hard-ass mentality with no experience as a coach. It all kind of backfired on him really, really suddenly. And yeah, I there's not a whole lot you can say of the role he was in. He really didn't succeed. So I think Matt Turner, maybe he might get some credit for it. And Carles Heel, he certainly deserves a lot of credit for him because it seemed like he was a person that Friedl had connections to and Friedl made happen. So I think you have to give him credit for Carles Heel. But outside of that, I don't think his legacy has changed a whole lot more since, because of this run and because of Carles Heel's impact on the team. I don't really think he's going to be thought of very fondly beyond that.
On the topic of Claude Dielna too, it's crazy to think in 2018 we only had one designated player on the roster, and that was Claude Dielna. And to think about today where we are, the growth that we've had, especially after Brad Friedl has left, has just been exponential. It's been insane. To go from one designated player who is not even in the league anymore 3 years later to now having three pretty solid designated players on your roster is pretty impressive.
I guess the other way to flip his legacy is that he was so bad that he embarrassed the Crafts enough to get them to open up their checkbook more to go out and sign a guy like Bruce Arena. They knew they couldn't do another inexperienced coach that would be as terrible as Brad Friedl was. So I guess that's part of his legacy too, is that he was just so terrible. He helped make sure that Bruce Arena was the next Revolution coach. I don't know if you had someone, Jay Heaps as coach for those 2 years, if the result would ended up being going to Bruce Arena. I think that was part of that was a reaction to, we are so terrible right now. We can't afford to do this again. We need to spend the money to get somebody like Bruce Arena. So in a way, that's part of his legacy.
Well, and we talked about this a few years ago. I remember someone saying, who's to blame for this mess? And really, there's blame all the way around because Mike Burns certainly shouldered some blame. Robert Kraft shouldered some blame, and Brad Friedl shouldered some blame. And it's tough for me to completely dump on Brad Friedl because I think Mike Burns, he was brought in as someone I think Mike Burns thought would, I don't want to say control, but an ally of Mike Burns, so to speak. And it was such a disaster. I think, as you say, Robert Kraft realized, this is not a way to run a soccer franchise. So it doesn't speak highly of Brad Friedl very much. And I don't think he deserves all the blame that he gets. But he was not ready to coach a team of that level. TSB 11 says, who from Revs 2 is primed to make the jump to the first team? And I think we got an answer to that today. John Bell signed, well, he didn't sign a contract, but the Revs traded for John Bell's college rights, who, San Jose drafted him last year. Here, I'll go into the story. When you draft a player, you have their MLS rights for 2 years, essentially, 2 MLS seasons. So even if a player does not sign with the MLS team and they go to a USL side, if they wanted to go back to MLS, essentially you need that team's consent or you need to acquire their rights. So, for example, I know Ryo Shimazaki, who was a Revs 2 right back last season. If the Revs wanted to sign him, they would have had to have traded with Columbus to get his college rights. So that's essentially what's happened here with John Bell. He was drafted by San Jose, and the Revs have acquired his college rights for a 4th-round Super Draft pick in 2022, which the 4th round of the 2022 Super Draft might not even exist. So this is essentially a free trade. The Revs are just more or less making it a formality. I assume this is to sign John Bell to a first-team contract. It might be just to do it, to have it. And as I say, the Revs have his MLS rights for one more year, essentially. So it might be if they want to sign him during the season, that's what they do. But I would say John Bell has moved to the front of the line to Revs 2 players who might get a MLS contract. Do you guys have any names you want to throw out there as potentially making the jump?
I know I got 2 names in mind. One of them would be Thiago Mendonka, 25-year-old defensive midfielder. Last year was his first season as a professional player, and he looked really good. He's, to have your first year as a professional being 25 years old and being in USL 1 is not necessarily the best sign. But he's a Portuguese player who brings a lot of tenacity to the pitch, and he definitely showed that he has the ability to score from distance. If you give him space, he's going to take the shot. I've seen him do it several different times. I've seen him dribble in the box, which is something that you don't see very often as a defensive midfielder. But he defensively as well has been pretty sound defender as well. So he would be my first choice. I just don't know how he would fit right now in an already muddied midfield with presumably some bigger name coming in down the line. But then my other choice is going to be Joe Rice, because we don't have Jeff Caldwell anymore. Joe Rice, I didn't look up his age. I should have done that beforehand, because if he would have to be on the senior roster, then maybe it wouldn't make sense. But Joe Rice showed the ability to really be a flashy goaltender. He made 2 or 3 save of the week plays for USL League One, and I'm pretty sure he also won Save of the Year it was a game against the Flamingos there. I forget what they're Forward Madison, yes. So and it was such a good save. I think we lost that game like 4-1, but I digress on that point. Joe Rice has really showed that he can be a shot stopper.
I got nothing to add to that list other than the John Bell move makes sense, if only in the sense that the Revolution have room for depth at center back. So if he showed something for Revs 2, that's a position that it makes sense to bring somebody up, especially if Delamay and Mancian are gone. There could be some minutes there.
I'd be surprised if this is the only center back they acquire. I still think they need a third center back. So I think Verfuth is number 4 and John Bell is number 5. But it's worth noting that John Bell is also a natural left back. So we talk about how the Revs were kind of short at outside back, kind of in the playoffs. He's a left-footed left back. I hate to say this because I feel this is insulting to Seth Sinovic, but he might fill the Seth Sinovic role. He might replace Seth Sinovic as emergency left back, if no one else is available. I think he might be a third string left back behind Jones and Butner, and kind of Butner insurance if he goes down and hurt for the season, while also kind of playing a fifth center back role. I really don't expect to see him get many minutes, even if he is signed to a first team contract. But it's certainly encouraging, and that getting his college rights is a step towards signing him. I can't see many reasons to doing that. And in terms of Joe Rice, his age would have to would force them to move him to the senior roster, which I think is a pretty significant hurdle, because I do think Joe Rice would be a perfect third string goalkeeper that you could keep playing at Revs 2 for game days while Knighton and Turner hold down the goalkeeping duties in the 18. But alas. We also got a comment from Quite Revs. He said, I'd like to hear some talk about the players who just signed for Revs 2. I'll go through this really, really quickly, but the Revs 2 signed 4 players. Actually, I think they signed 2 new players that I haven't done any research on, so I'll skip those 2. But Sean O'Hearn, who was signed an outside back out of Georgetown, I think that's a pretty significant signing, because anyone who knows anything about college soccer, Georgetown is one of the best teams in the country. So I think automatically that's going to be a guy who is going to be an impact player for Revs 2. Michael DeShields, who's a center back out of Wake Forest, goalkeeper Marquez Pucarin, and then they signed a Revolution Academy product, Colby, I'm going to mispronounce this, Quinones, who is a Bedford, New Hampshire native. I know he made an impact at right back last season, so I expect him to kind of hold that down. He's only, I think, 17 or 18. Yeah, 17 years old. So that might be a long-term prospect for the Revs, although, as I say, I can't imagine they move him up to the first team anytime soon with the depth at right back. O'Hearn and DeShields are both 22 years old. As I say, I think O'Hearn is a left back. as I say, that's going to be a player to watch for Revs 2. The name I'm most excited about is Puckerin, who he trained with the Atlanta United's academy. He also trained in Europe with Aberdeen and West Ham United. So he's very, very well traveled. It's going to be interesting to see how much they divide time between him and Joe Rice, because, as Chris said, Joe Rice had such a stellar season, and his option was exercised. You would think Puckerin is the better long-term prospect who has more of a chance of breaking into the first team. So I expect them to maybe rotate. I know they rotated Keegan Meyer and Joe Rice a little bit last year.
And Keegan Meyer's not around anymore, right? They let him go, I think.
The two players they drafted last year, Simon LeCressner, who I think was hurt for most of the season, and Keegan Meyer, both were let go by Revs too. I don't think they made much of an impact last season, so neither of those guys will be back. Their term with the Revolution are over. And I also know Ryo Shimazaki has gone for the season, has left, so he was not re-signed either. The Revs did sign two new players, I think, this week. One of them was Francis Dulissi, and another was Michael Costa da Silva. Dulissi came out of Manhattan College after beginning at UCF, and Michael Costa da Silva is a Brazilian who is 18 years old. I guess he's turning 19 soon, but he is teammates with Maciel. So the Revs have a nice little Brazil pipeline coming in. I can't say I've watched much tape on either of them. This signings was made 4 days ago, so I'm a little behind the ball on those two signings. But overall, O'Hearn is the guy you're going to want to keep an eye out for, just because of his ties to Georgetown. And from what I understand, if he had entered the Super Draft, which I don't know why he wasn't in the Super Draft, but he looked like he was going to be someone that would have gone in round 1 or 2. So those are kind of the Revs 2 signings of what we know about him now. Overall, I don't expect any of them to make an impact on Revs 1, at least for a couple of years. So that does it for listener questions. One more note before we go. MLS released their 25 greatest players really quick because we're very, very long on time. Sean, how upset are you that Twellman and Shawry did not make the list?
Yeah, I mean, it's going through the list. I have trouble finding too many faults with it, but I think Shawry Joseph in particular, and Shawry sticks out to me more than Twellman. I know, Twellman was a fantastic goal scorer, but Shawry sticks out to me more than Twellman because Shawry, I think, was the best player at his position for half a dozen years at least as a defensive midfielder, and he dominated in a way that few other players can. And he dominated in a way that none of the other defensive midfielders, I think, on this list even have done it, more so than an Ozzy Alonso, more so than a Kyle Beckerman. And that's kind of the point I wanted to bring up too, is when you look at Shawry Joseph's career, and Shawry talked about this throughout his career too. If Shawry Joseph hadn't been cap-tied to Granada as a teenager, he would have been a regular starter on the U.S. national team. And I think he would have been a guy that would have taken away really any chance for Kyle Beckerman to play on the U.S. national team. And I think it would have been a no-brainer, no contest that Shawry Joseph was on this team instead of Kyle Beckerman. I get, Taylor Twellman and how he was such a big name for the Revolution and how good he was. But to me, the bigger omission is Shawry Joseph, because Shawry Joseph, just the way he dominated that position and the way he was able to carry the Revolution team when they were bad, is something that few players in league history have been able to do. And for that, I think he really deserved to be on this MLS 25 list. No, he didn't play till he was 40 like Kyle Beckerman's going to do. But the number of years where he just absolutely dominated are something very, very few players can do.
I think if this was a MLS Best 26 list, I think Shawry Joseph might have made the list. He seemed like he was the one name that people were most upset about, even beyond New England. I think there were a lot of MLS writers who were very confused at how Shawry Joseph, who made MLS Best 11 4 times, was somehow left off of this list overall. And as you say, the comparisons to Beckerman are very interesting because I think a lot of people remember him as a legend, but comparing the two of them, and as you say, if Shawry Joseph had ended up playing for the United States men's national team, would Beckerman be as household a name as he is today? I'm not so sure about that. So
the MLS 25 list, I think, honestly did a disservice to defensive midfielders too, because I think it's just Beckerman on there, right? Like that's kind of I think that's almost overlooking a really important position.
It seems like they went with star power too, because I think Joseph Martinez made it, which okay, but how long has he been in MLS, and you're going to pick him over Twellman? I mean, I don't know. I understand it. I understand he's had some big seasons, but I don't know. I feel like that was maybe Atlanta United fans got to vote on this too.
A side note on the Beckerman too is he's 38 years old and now out of contract. Is that something that the Revs look at?
you know, you know, I wouldn't put it past Bruce Arena.
That's what I'm thinking now.
I mean, he would be a $200,000 a year signing to maybe play one season, and to some extent it might be good to have that veteran presence in there. But that's the type of signing that I don't think is going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did.
Yep.
Maybe one or two of the, I'm not saying he's going to go out there and sign 5 38-year-olds, but it wouldn't surprise me if he signed one or two to a 1-year contract to have that veteran presence to give them, late game minutes to try to close out a game, or, filling in here or there.
Has Kyle Beckerman not retired?
I don't think he's ever going to retire.
Yeah. I think he's out of contract with RSL. I don't know. I haven't heard any retirement announcement from him.
Yeah, I just Googled it. I don't know why I assumed he retired. I looked at it.
He shaved his hair, and then he kind of disappeared.
Yeah, maybe it's like Wando, where I just think he's retiring every year, and he always just kind of pops back up. But
yes.
Wando was supposed to retire, but he decided not to.
He just keeps coming back. He loves scoring goals, and he doesn't have to play Belgium in MLS. So. Before we go, actually, I do want to bring up one more thing. I meant to bring this up during the Revs 2 signings, but I did promise some people on Twitter that we're going to have some supplemental roster talk, so I'll try to keep this short. We talked about the senior roster, 20 spots, 8 of them are currently open. There's really no restrictions with those. I just want to kind of give a quick update of the supplemental roster, how it works. This season, there's going to be kind of 3 tiers, spots 21 through 24, spots 25 through 28, and then spots 29 and 30. Spots 29 and 30 have to be filled by homegrown players, and right now those are filled by Justin Rennicks and Damian Rivera. Spots 21 through 24 are a mix of things. It could be homegrown players, it could be Generation Adidas players or Super Draft players, and then homegrown players who make a certain amount of money. So right now those 3 spots are Thiago Mendonka, Scott Caldwell, Henry Kessler. And then 25 through 28 is essentially players that make the league minimum. It's called the supplemental or the reserve minimum, and those can be filled by it's got to be players who are under the age of 24 or under, and essentially they're either homegrown players or like Revs 2 signings. So right now the Revolution have 1 spot open from 21 to 24, so that's going to be probably 1 draft pick. I don't expect the Revs to sign more than 1 draft pick. And then 25 through 28, they have 3 spots open. So John Bell will probably slide into one of those spots, and I could see maybe them signing another Revs 2 player, although I don't expect it. It's a bit that adds to the Anking Firmino thing a little wrinkle, because those guys took up 25 through 28 spots. So I'm kind of surprised that they cleared them out, because I don't think they really need those roster spots very much. But just wanted to kind of give an outlook on the supplemental roster spots, because we kind of say 6 through 10. I think people can say, oh, we can fill it up with 4 super draft picks or whatnot. But really the reason why we see super draft picks being used less and less every year is because the rosters are a little bit more and more restrictive every year. And in terms of the Revs, they're only going to be able to sign 1 super draft pick, unless MLS changes their rules between now and then, which I could see happening. But overall, if you're looking forward to the Super Draft as a Revs fan, I really wouldn't, because they're drafting toward the end of the first round, and I don't expect them to add a Tayon Buchanan or Dejuan Jones or Henry Kessler this year. I think we might sign a Revs 2 player, and maybe they trade up and grab a Super Draft player, but I don't expect to see many signings in the supplemental roster section of the roster. So I assume you guys don't have anything to add on top of that.
No, their super draft pick is 24, and last year's 24th pick didn't even sign with he was LAFC and didn't even sign with LAFC's second team. So don't expect much.
This is the year that we see someone pass on a first round draft pick. I'm pretty convinced of that. I don't know where Philly is drafting. I think they're drafting 20th or 19th or 18th or something like that. And they traded it last year for something like a waiver. They moved up in the waiver allocation. I think we're going to see a pass this year, just because it used to be the supplemental and reserve rosters were open. All the spots were open to draft picks, and now it's just 21 through 24. So, in a weird way, MLS is restricting the use of super draft picks, which seems kind of counterintuitive to me, because I think people like the super draft, but alas, it's slowly being faded out. So that wraps us up here today. Chris, where can people find you on Twitter?
Find me on Twitter at Revs Revolt.
You can find me at Sean L. Donahue.
All right, and you can follow us at Revolution Recap on Twitter, and also please like our Revolution Recap Facebook page. You can also shoot us an email at revolutionrecap@gmail.com. And if you have not already, please rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you're listening. We'll be checking in off season when news comes up, and hopefully we'll have some bonus episodes to help you pass the time. But until then, thank you everyone for listening, and go Revs.